Nationalism makes the sovereignty dispute in the East China Sea a highly explosive issue for China, more so than the South China Sea. And this is due to the brutal Japanese occupation of China in the 1930s, and hence the sentiments of the status of these islands, the Diaoyu and Senkaku, run very deep in the Chinese psyche than any other territorial dispute in modern Chinese history.
That conversation is coming up in just a moment. From Asian News Weekly, you're listening to Asia Now, a collection of stories and interviews from the Asia Pacific region. China and Japan face off over a small group of islands in the East China Sea. Japan calls them the Senkakus. China says they're Diaoyu and belong to them. This territorial conflict is just one conversation taking place in Asia now. Welcome everyone to Asia Now. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I would like to take an opportunity to thank you for downloading and listening to this week's show. Japan's strained relationship dates back with its neighbors long before the start of the Second World War. In addition to accusations that Japan whitewashes history and doesn't show signs of remorse over its past military aggression, there's the matter of competing claims on a group of islands in the resource-rich East China Sea. Joining me once again on the program via Skype is Suhith Sitarthan, a strategic analyst who has worked with some of the top think tanks in the Netherlands and Australia. Suhith, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Now, we're talking about some of the contested areas, the disputed areas in the China Seas, and Japan is actually involved in one of them. I was wondering if you could do me a favor and explain really briefly what exactly is the controversy, who are the parties involved, for those that may not have an intimate knowledge of the issue.
Well, that's fine. Basically, the issue is about the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and this is a very, very volatile issue because what you have is you have the world's second and the world's third largest economy engaged in a standoff over the sovereignty of 5 islets and 3 rocks in the East China Sea, known to the Chinese, of course, as the Diaoyu Islands, and to the Japanese as Senkaku. This is quite interesting because for a range of reasons. Partially, if you look at it, nationalism makes the sovereignty dispute in the East China Sea a highly explosive issue for China, more so than the South China Sea. And this is due to the brutal Japanese occupation of China in the 1930s, and hence the sentiments of the status of these islands, the Diaoyu and Senkaku, run very deep in the Chinese psyche than any other territorial dispute in modern Chinese history, with the sole exception, of course, of Taiwan. Now, the island itself lies about 170 kilometers north of Japan's westernmost island, Ishigaki, and 330 kilometers southeast of the Chinese mainland coast, and 170 kilometers northeast of Taiwan, which China considers as its 23rd province, but we're not going to that. That's a bit murky as well. Strategically, for the Chinese especially, control of these islands allows them access to the Pacific Ocean beyond the first island chain linking South Korea, Japan's Okinawa Prefecture, Taiwan, and the Philippines. For Japan, losing the islands would mean providing China with a platform to not only monitor Japanese and U.S. military activities in Okinawa, which is roughly about 400 kilometers in the east, but the Chinese could potentially use it to curtail their freedom of naval navigation. Of course, you have this idea of the strategic aspect and also the economic aspect. And economically, and this is according to the figures given by the United States Energy Information Administration, who have kind of roughly estimated that the entire East China Sea has about 60 and 100 million barrels of oil and between 1 and 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in proven and probable reserves. And at present, like you mentioned earlier on, the parties involved, at present there are 2 contesting parties involved, and these are China and Japan. However, the United States have historically played a major role in the evolution of this dispute.
Well, you're absolutely right in that because it was recently stated that the United States would consider this part of Japan's territory and back Japan up should a confrontation occur.
Well, basically, I think 4 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, I think Hillary Clinton actually made that sort of commitment, which is interesting because the Chinese at the time were taken aback by the sense of by the stance of the United States, primarily because all throughout past administration, I mean, going all the way from Nixon all the way throughout, there've never been an official in the United States that actually made such a statement. And basically, what she said was, to paraphrase, of course, was that in respect to the Senkaku Islands, she said the United States has never taken a position on sovereignty, but we have made it very clear that the islands are part of our mutual treaty obligations, and the obligation is to defend Japan. And many Chinese strategists believe that the US Japan security alliance is the largest obstacle to taking over the islands by force. Now, you know, the US and Japan signed a bilateral treaty of mutual cooperation and security, which is, by the way, a 10-year renewable agreement that stipulates that any attack on territories under Japan's administration would require
U.S. intervention, yeah.
exactly. So for them, this particular treaty, which is actually quite dangerous for the Chinese at this moment, is a major stumbling block, and that's the reason why there hasn't been a conflict as of yet. But you can't rule out a conflict in this area. So
Right. It's one of those dangerous areas that should something occur, it could easily escalate and possibly spiral out of control. And even now we see Prime Minister Shinzo Abe willing to put more quote unquote boots on the ground, more police forces, extend radar observation area posts in that area to keep a closer eye on China. So if Japan were to lose it, then China could come in and do the same to, as you mentioned, to Japanese and U.S. interests.
absolutely.
But I have a question. So going back in history, is there a picture that one can paint as to who these islands may have originally belonged to? Because in the first Sino-Japanese War, some territory did change hands as part of the treaty. And is it possible that this little small group of islands and islets, rocks, were part of that?
Well, it is entirely possible. I mean, the Chinese have claimed to have exercised sovereignty over these islands during the Ming Dynasty, which was between 1368 to 1644. That was their reign. And they also lay claims that the island was part of an administrative of Taiwan during the reign of the Qing Dynasty, which was also between 1644 and 1912. And historically, as early as the 16th century, three of the Senkaku Islands, namely Otsureshima, Kubashima, specifically mentioned by the Chinese names as Diaoyu and Huangweiyu and Chiweiyu in the travel accounts of the Chinese envoys sent by the Ming Dynasty to hold investiture ceremonies for the kings of the Ryukyu Islands, which is also known as the part of Okinawa. The Chinese envoys usually proceeded to Ryukyu Islands from Fucha via Taiwan and the islets to northeast of Taiwan, including Teoyutai and Huangweiyu and Chichiueiyu. These islets were then considered the boundary separating Taiwan from the Ryukyu Islands. Of course, if you mentioned the Sino-Japanese War, as a result of the defeat in the Sino-Japanese War, China actually ceded Taiwan to Japan under the Treaty of Shimonoseki in May of 1895. And under the Article 11 of that treaty, it states that China cedes to Japan in perpetuity and full sovereignty the following territories: the island of Formosa, which is currently Taiwan, together with all islands pertaining to or belonging to the said island of Formosa. In the meantime, following a January 14, 1895 Japanese cabinet decision to erect a marker on the Senkaku Islands, the islands were formally incorporated into the Yamima County, Okinawa Prefecture. And since 1896, they have been a part of the Ishigaki city. Now, for Japan, they have used, for their part, they've actually used the term terra nullius, which means that land that's uninhabited, to assert that they took control of the islands through the decision of the cabinet in 1895, and further asserts that the islands showed no trace of having been under the control of Chinese, thereby contradicting the Chinese arguments, the historical arguments claimed by China. China, for its part, argues the islands were ceded to Japan as part of the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki that ended the First Sino-Japanese War, and therefore should be returned to China under the Cairo and Potsdam Declarations in 43 and 45, respectively.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next, is that under the Potsdam Proclamation, Japan was supposed to return all of that land. So if that was the case, is it just this differing point of view over the Chinese position that this was part of the land ceded to Japan as part of the end of the First Sino-Japanese War? Or was it more or less the Japanese point of view that, well, these were uninhabited bits of land, so we just started administering it in, as you said, 1895?
Well, it's also a bit of both, to be honest. I think for China, China understands that if they took it into a legal point of view, they would lose. So they're looking towards the Cairo and Potsdam declarations to help them in a legal framework. As for Japan, they have the better part of the deal because basically the United States and Japan signed the Okinawa Reversion Treaty, in which the U.S. effectively returns full control of the Ryukyu Islands to Japan, which also involve Senkaku Diaoyu Islands as well. And this move was seen as reinforcing the U.S.-Japan security alliance. But more than that, the Okinawa Reversion Treaty provided for the return to Japan of all and any powers of administration, legislation, jurisdiction over the Ryukyu and Daito Islands. And Article 1 of the Okinawa Reversion Treaty defines the term as all territories with territorial waters with respect to which the right to exercise all and any powers of administration, legislation, and jurisdiction accord to U.S. Under Article 3. It also clearly defines the latitude and the longitude set forth in the agreed minute. And so for them, technically, in a legal perspective, they can actually use it in the ICJ when disputing China's claims over it. And I think the only claim that China has at the moment is basically one of history, which they still have to prove, and two, of trying to reignite the Cairo and Potsdam Declaration, in which all the territories must be seized. And so I think that's what the Chinese and the Japanese are at loggerheads with.
Well, one of the questions I have for you is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if memory serves, it wasn't really until, say, the 1970s or so that China really started pushing its claim for these lands once the United States kind of backed off their hands-on approach to administering Japan. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. There's a particular reason for it, actually. Deng Xiaoping, who ruled the country from 78 to 89, who presided over the negotiations and the signing of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with Japan, he had a plan. And his plan was, to put it succinctly, was to shelve the dispute. and it became a guiding principle for managing maritime sovereignty issues for a generation of Chinese leaders and diplomats. However, during that time, in between 68 and 69, I think that was the time frame you were looking at, the United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East published a very important report that found significant hydrocarbon resources in the seabed between Taiwan and Japan, which was the waters off the coast of the Diaoyu and Senkaku Islands. And although China had not previously disputed Japanese claim to the islands then, it asserted its own sovereignty over them in May 1907 through bilateral engagements and so on. And that was when it started really asserting its claim. Of course, 4 years ago, it started to really push for the Senkaku Diaoyu issue when a Chinese fishing boat ran two Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the islands. Of course, the fallout from this incident led to Japan's purchase of 3 out of 5 of the disputed islands from a private owner called Kuniyuki Kurihara in September 2012. Of course, Japan had several months to complete the transaction or even explore other options. but they expedited the process in part to complete it before China's once-in-a-decade leadership transition in November 2012. Now, that timing was calculated. It was calculated towards a step towards reconciliation with the incoming leadership in Beijing. But in China, of course, they had a different view. They believe the timing of the transaction, the property and sovereignty transaction in some circles, was made on the belief that the process of the transition of power in Beijing would leave it in a state of being incapable of dealing with the situation. And of course, by the beginning of 2013, Japan and China were locked in a volatile standoff with Chinese and Japanese law enforcement vessels in close proximity, creating a very dangerous clash. I mean, the risk for a very dangerous clash. And despite expression by both governments that they wish to avoid a military conflict, the potential for escalation has since increased exponentially. China's approach towards this reflects, 40 years ago and now, if you look at Chinese approach, it reflects a larger strategy of shifting from a land-focused power in both economic development and defense terms to a maritime power, which is a key component of its maritime rights. And the change of focus from landward to seaward security has led maritime security interests to become the most important part of China's strategic rationale. In fact, former President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao both stressed the importance of China becoming a maritime power in their final speeches in November 2012. New leaders Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have also reinforced the maritime power concept. Interestingly, before President Xi Jinping took over as head of the CCP in November, he was put in charge of a maritime security group called the Leading Small Group on the Protection of Maritime Interests in mid-2012, and then of the Office to Respond to the Diaoyu crisis in September. And in his first foreign policy speech after becoming head of the Communist Party, Xi stated that China will remain on the path of peaceful development, but he also warned countries who challenge China's maritime rights and interests, specifically Japan, that their main security threat comes from the seas and they will do whatever it takes to protect their own national security. Now China is very afraid at the moment. 10 years ago, they were actually more afraid than they were now. And primarily because they were afraid that if they don't challenge Japan in this dispute, the Japanese could cement its claim if it would allow de facto control of the islands unchallenged through the international doctrine of acquisition prescription.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up because I want to talk about that. Do you think that their extensive delay essentially voided their say? You have a situation after Potsdam in the 1940s, all the way up until the 1970s, until they really started pushing for this. I mean, that's a span of 30 years. If it was something that's so intrinsic to China and Chinese identity, a 30-year gap is a huge gap. And we always talk about acquiescence in terms of these contested areas being one of the many things we look at, and as of who does this really belong to? Could that ultimately hurt their case?
It could. It could really hurt their case. But it hasn't stopped them before. You see, the thing is with China, they know they don't have much of a strong case in relation to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. In fact, legally, I don't think any court would actually agree that China should have the islands. I think it would be more leaning towards the Japanese argument. But the fact that they've actually the fact that they understand the legal doctrine of acquisition prescription. By the way, for your listeners, the legal doctrine of acquisition prescription is a principle that allows the state to acquire a territory by exercising or administrating the area over a period of time. But it sets conditions, including acquiescence of other interested parties. And acquiescence can either be expressed or implied. Implied acquiescence can take many forms, but broadly it is seen as the failure of another state, like you mentioned, to protest the claimant state authority over the territory and the failure to refer the matter to the adequate international organization or tribunal, such as the United Nations or the ICJ within an appropriate period of time. And for them, actually, the Japanese purchase of the islands provided China with a moment to redefine their strategic rationale. And that is why they were very aggressive in those waters recently. And even though I don't think that any Chinese leaders or any Chinese policy analysts would actually think that they could actually have a serious claim, because it's been a period of more than 30 years which they haven't actually lay claim to the islands. So in terms of legalistically speaking, they don't really have much of a case. But if they were to change their maritime security strategy, then they don't really need to go through the ICJ or the UN. They can continue with the status quo of administering the islands without explicitly going forth and claiming sovereignty over it.
All right, so we're starting to run out of time, so I have one final question. And this really is starting to look towards the future. Do you see any sign that some amicable solution could come about where both sides would be satisfied with the end result? Or are we destined to have this butting of the heads?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, that's like the $1,000,000 question that everybody wants to know. The thing is, these two countries have tried in the past to establish hotlines with one another in times of crisis. But a hotline would only work when two countries have similar bureaucracies and strong mutual trust, both of which are lacking in this case. For instance, the Prime Minister of Japan heads the cabinet, the ruling party, and the self-defense force, while the Chinese premier does not head the Communist Party, nor does he command the People's Liberation Army. He had to get his message approved before speaking in a crisis. So efforts to establish a similar military hotline even have stalled due to the same reasons. And China and Japan, for instance, have disagreed over the delineation of their respective exclusive economic zones in the East China Sea. And with this level of complexity, a judicial or even an arbitrary settlement would be the most logical solution. There's little chance that an international tribunal will be able to examine the issue, because Japan does not formally acknowledge that a dispute exists and believes it would be up to China to refer the issue to the International Court of Justice. China, on its part, does not accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the court, as due to the nature of this issue, Beijing realizes that they might lose the case because they really don't have a case. Thus, rather than lose the case, they have decided to use rhetoric based on unfounded assumptions to cast aspersions to the fairness of the ICJ's proceeding. In practice, however, the UN and the UN clause provide several means for the peaceful settlement of maritime disputes, negotiation, conciliation, for instance, taking the dispute to a state or international body such as the UN Secretary General, and arbitration, which can be done ad hoc in a tribunal, or even International Court of Justice or International Tribunal for Law Sea. But ultimately, peace hinges upon effectively managing differences. And cooperation on joint resource management in the East China Sea, and while setting aside but not renouncing maritime claims, could be a practical way to build mutual trust and reap tangible benefits. The current failure of resolving this issue at present demonstrates the limits of influence of Chinese and Japanese leaders. And it is further complicated by the struggles of their own ministries, as well as the need to placate rising nationalism in both these countries. And if they can do that, if they can stem the tide of rising nationalism and try to work together, despite their own internal politics in their own ministry, then I think you might have a chance of trying to resolve and reconcile this issue. But it's not going to be easy.
Suhith Sitarthan, thank you very much for joining us this week.
No, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you.
Suhith Sitarthan is a strategic analyst who has worked with some of the top think tanks in the Netherlands and Australia. And again, I'd like to thank him for joining me. You, of course, heard from him, and now I want to hear from you. Who do you think has the better claim? Are the islands an inherent part of Japan? Or should they have been returned to China as part of the Potsdam Proclamation? Please leave your comments on our webpage, on Facebook, or Twitter. Now, if you haven't found us on social media, you can connect with us on Facebook. The address is facebook.com/Asia News Weekly. And of course, we're at Asia News Weekly on Twitter. If you'd like to send us a voice comment, you can do that. Just fire up your Skype and send a message and leave a voicemail to Asia News Weekly. When you leave that message, just be sure to include your name and where you're calling from. If you'd like to send an email to the show, you can do that as well. The address is asianewsweekly@gmail.com. You can send your questions and feedback there, but if you'd also like to send an audio comment, I'll be happy to take that as well. You can, of course, play and download our shows on the web, but if you'd prefer the show in podcast form, just look for us on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Thanks again for listening. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.